She arrived on a Tuesday, which the Vorkai called the day of cataloging, because that was what they did on Tuesdays. They cataloged things. Her name was Mara Osai. She was 17 years old, 162 centimeters tall, and she weighed 51 kilograms. She had a scar along her left jawline from a bicycle accident when she was 9. She kept her hair in 2 braids that she tucked into the collar of her uniform, and she walked with her eyes slightly downcast. Not from submission, her teachers would later note in their reports, but from the habit of watching where she put her feet. These things the Academy's intake system recorded with perfect accuracy. What the intake system could not record was the way she paused at the entrance arch and counted the guards, 7, with overlapping patrol rotations that left a 4-second gap at the 3rd pillar every 11 minutes. Or the way her eyes moved, for just a fraction of a second, to the conduit lines running along the ceiling before she smiled politely at the registration officer and handed over her documents. The intake system was not designed to record things like that. The Vorkai Academy of Integrated Species Sciences occupied an entire floating structure above the moon Pelassus, which was mostly ocean. The academy itself was a city of pressurized chambers and sealed corridors, its lower levels hanging in the perpetual blue twilight of the moon's upper atmosphere, its towers rising into vacuum. It had been built, originally, to study the smaller species of the Vorkai Dominion, to classify them, understand their biology, assess their potential threat levels, and educate their more promising young in the ways of Vorkai civilization. It was, the Academy's promotional material explained, a gesture of inclusion. There were 11,000 students enrolled. Of those, 12 were human. 12 was a number the faculty had agreed on after 3 weeks of debate, not enough to constitute a block, not so few as to seem like a deliberate slight. 12 was a comfortable, manageable number, enough to satisfy the political pressures from the recently signed Accord of Shared Skies, while leaving the Academy's essential character undisturbed. The faculty had categorized humans in their standard threat assessment matrix as Category 3, minor species, limited potential. This placed them between the Groon, the small burrowing creatures who were good at mathematics but physically harmless, and the Yeth, an amphibious people who were easily startled. The classification had been reached after a careful review of humanity's available data, average physical specifications, average cognitive test scores, average reaction times under controlled conditions. The matrix was very good at averaging things. Senior advisor Pellock had been the one to formalize the human classification. He was the head of species assessment, a Vorkai of considerable status. His neck frills were a deep amber, which indicated his rank within the faculty hierarchy, and he wore them fanned out at all times, which indicated he knew it. He had spent 40 years refining the threat assessment matrix and was very proud of it. It had correctly classified 732 species, and he saw no reason why species 733 would be any different. They are unremarkable, he had said, in the faculty meeting where the classification was finalized. Their cognitive scores place them in the upper middle range for Category 3. Their physical parameters are modest. Their technological development, while accelerating, remains well below the threshold of concern. I recommend Category 3 with a secondary notation of monitored. His colleague, Senior Advisor Thess, who ran the Academy's Security Integration Department, had agreed. Thess was cautious by nature. It was why she'd been given the security portfolio, but she found Pellock's matrix compelling. She had added one addendum, a standard surveillance protocol for the human cohort, which was less a reflection of genuine concern and more a bureaucratic formality, something for the file. The third member of the senior faculty trio, Advisor Don, who oversaw academic affairs, had barely participated in the classification debate. He was managing a succession crisis of his own. The headmaster, old Vorkai of 73 seasons, was preparing to name his replacement, and Don had spent the better part of the last 2 years maneuvering himself into position. He had very little interest in humans. He had a great deal of interest in who would run the academy after the headmaster retired. So 3 senior advisors, competing ambitions, a classification system they trusted completely, and 12 humans about to walk through the door. Mara Os was the last of the 12 to register. She was also the last to be assigned quarters because there had been an administrative error. The intake system had failed to correctly process her biometric profile on the first attempt, then the second, then the third. The intake officer, a junior Voakai named Seal, had been flustered and apologetic. Mara had told him it was no trouble. She'd sat in the waiting area for 2 hours, reading a battered paperback novel she produced from her jacket pocket, and when the system finally accepted her data on the 4th attempt, she'd thanked Seal warmly and followed the corridor map to her assigned room without complaint. Seal filed a routine maintenance report on the biometric scanner. The report went to the technical department, where it sat for 6 days before being reviewed, at which point the technician noted that the scanner had functioned correctly on all 4 attempts, but that each of the 4 readings had produced a slightly different result, as though the subject had somehow presented 4 marginally distinct biometric profiles. The technician flagged it as sensor drift and recalibrated the unit. He did not flag it as anything else. Mara's roommate was a Groon girl named Pitta, who was small and nervous and brilliant at topology. They got along very well. Pitta taught Mara the Voakai numeric system on their first evening, sketching it on a notepad in quick, precise strokes. Mara learned it in 40 minutes. Pitta thought this was impressive. Mara told her she had a good teacher. She was not lying exactly, but the truth was that she had already learned the Voakai numeric system before she arrived. She had learned it from a paper published 6 months earlier by a Voakai mathematician at a university on the Dominion's capital world. She had also learned conversational Voakai, standard technical Voakai, the administrative dialect used in official communications, and enough of the older ceremonial form to navigate documents that hadn't been updated in 50 years. She had learned all of this in 8 months, while also completing her standard Earth schoolwork, helping her mother with her younger siblings on weekends, and working 12 hours a week at the bakery 2 streets from her apartment. She had a gift for languages. She had a gift for a lot of things. She kept quiet about most of them. The first month at the academy passed without incident, which was the only outcome Mara had planned for. She attended every class. She sat in the middle of the room, never the back drew attention in a different way. She answered questions when called upon and not before. Her scores were good but not exceptional, clustered at the high end of the mean for her cohort, good enough that no one could complain about her performance, unremarkable enough that no one looked at her twice. She made friends slowly and carefully. 3 other students she genuinely liked, whose company she enjoyed, and whose rhythm she understood well enough that being around them required no performance at all. The other 11 humans she was friendly with but not close to. Several of them were brilliant in ways that made them visible. A boy named Theo had the highest mathematics scores in the cohort and had been invited to sit in on Pelok's advanced seminar. A girl named Adiz had argued publicly and successfully against a Voakai student 3 times her size in the ethics colloquium, and had become something of a minor celebrity for it. These were her people, her kin across the ocean of stars, and she felt a warm, fierce pride in watching them. She also made a point of never being photographed near them. She was learning the shape of the place. The academy was, she had concluded, organized around a principle that no one had stated explicitly but that governed everything, the assumption that the Voakai were the center of things, and that everything else orbited them. Not maliciously, that was the part that was easy to miss. The faculty weren't cruel. Many of them were genuinely enthusiastic about the smaller species they studied and taught. but their enthusiasm was the enthusiasm of collectors, of naturalists. They found the lesser species interesting in the way that interesting things are interesting, which is to say, interesting in their place, interesting within their category, interesting as long as they remained legible. The threat assessment matrix was the purest expression of this. Mara had obtained a copy of the public-facing summary document from the Academy Library in her third week. She had read it 3 times. She had then written 8 pages of notes in the private cipher she developed when she was 12, which she kept in the hollow spine of the paperback novel she carried everywhere. The matrix, she had concluded, was very good at seeing what it expected to see. Pellock had built it to measure things that Volkai understood as dangerous: physical mass, energy output, territorial aggression, demonstrated military capability, technological advancement as measured against Volkai benchmarks. It was a brilliant system for cataloging known types of threat. It was completely blind to anything it hadn't thought to look for. It had no category for patience. It had no category for adaptability, not the kind that registered in aptitude tests, but the deep, structural human capacity to reshape themselves to fit whatever container the universe put them in. It had no category for the particular human skill of being underestimated and finding it useful. It had no category, she noted with a small, private smile, for someone who could pass through 4 biometric scans in a row and come out reading differently each time. She put her notes away and went to dinner. The faculty politics intensified in the second month. Mara observed them the way she observed most things, from a middle distance, assembling information that no single observation would have given her. Pellock and Thess were formally allied. They had been for years, their combined influence forming the dominant bloc in faculty governance. But Don was making moves. He had cultivated relationships with 3 of the headmaster's direct reports, and there were rumors that the headmaster had privately expressed concern that Pellock's matrix was becoming outdated. The whisper campaign was subtle enough that most of the student body was unaware of it, but it had changed the texture of faculty interactions in ways that Mara could feel without being able to fully articulate. She found this interesting. A court divided is a court distracted. She had also been paying close attention to the Academy's physical infrastructure. Not in any way that would be visible, she was never where she shouldn't be, never accessing anything she wasn't authorized to access. She simply noticed things. The patrol patterns she'd clocked on day 1, the locations of the emergency pressure seals and what would happen if they were engaged in a specific sequence. The server architecture she deduced from the network latency patterns when she did legitimate research in the library. The 3 maintenance corridors that ran parallel to the main administrative wing and were, she'd confirmed, included in none of the standard student maps. She was not planning anything. She was simply learning the shape of the place. This was what she did. This was what humans did: map the space, understood the rules, found the edges where the rules went soft. It was not aggression. It was not ambition. It was something older than both. The bone-deep mammalian instinct to understand the territory before the territory turned on you. On the 53rd day of term, Advisor Thess's surveillance protocol flagged a minor anomaly in the human cohort's access patterns. A student, the system logged it as student H7, which was Mara, had spent an above-average number of hours in the library, accessing a below-average number of distinct resources. The access pattern suggested prolonged engagement with a small set of materials rather than broad research. Thess reviewed the flag herself. She cross-referenced the access materials: a public Volkai mathematics paper, several standard introductory texts, a history of the Academy's administrative structure, technical documentation for the life support systems, all publicly available, all appropriate for a student familiarizing themselves with their new environment. She noted it and moved on. The surveillance protocol was generating 14,000 flags a week across all cohorts. She could not investigate each one. She filed it and turned her attention back to the problem of Dawn, who had just submitted a formal proposal to the headmaster, suggesting that the threat assessment matrix be reviewed and updated. This was, as far as Tess was concerned, a far more pressing concern than a human student spending extra hours in the library. The third month brought the midterm integration assessment, a practical examination unique to the multi-species cohorts, designed to test how well students of different species could collaborate under pressure. Teams of 5 were assembled by the faculty, deliberately mixing species. Mara was placed in a team with 2 Volkai students, a Groon and a Yeth. The scenario given to them was a simulated emergency, a partial pressure seal failure in one of the academy's lower chambers, requiring the team to coordinate a response using available resources. The Volkai students immediately began debating who should lead the team. The debate was civil but time-consuming, as each of them had strong views and the social calculus of Volkai group dynamics required extensive negotiation around rank and framing. The Groon, a male named Sas, began quietly calculating seal failure propagation rates. The Yeth student, whose name Mara couldn't quite pronounce and who had asked her to call him Ren, moved to the edge of the group and made himself small in the way Yeth did when they were anxious. Mara sat down on the floor, spread out the schematic they'd been given, and started working. She was not taking charge. She was very careful not to look like she was taking charge. She asked Sas, without looking up, whether he could project his propagation calculations onto the relevant section of the map. She said it in the way she might say pass the salt, not a command, not quite a request, something in between that assumed cooperation without demanding it. Sas, who had been calculating in his own head and was relieved to have a surface to work on, moved over immediately. She asked Ren if he was okay, not whether he could help, whether he was okay. Ren blinked at her and then, surprising himself, nodded. She said she thought the sensor array in Corridor 4 would have a better angle on the failure point, and did he want to go check? She said it in a way that suggested she was doing him a favor by asking, giving him a purpose, a direction, a reason to move. He went. The 2 Volkai students finished their leadership negotiation and turned back to find that the team had already mapped the failure propagation, identified the 3 optimal pressure seal sequences, and had a preliminary response plan laid out on the floor in front of them. Mara looked up when they arrived and said she hoped that was okay. She'd just been thinking through the schematic while they were working, and would they like to review it? The team completed the assessment in the second fastest time in the cohort's history. The faculty evaluator's report noted strong collaborative performance, unusual effectiveness given cross-species composition, and recommended the team for the advanced practical stream in the next term. In the notes on individual students, Mara was described as a supportive presence with good spatial reasoning. The evaluator had not quite registered what she'd actually done. Pelak reviewed the assessment reports that evening and felt a small, warm glow of satisfaction. The Matrix had predicted that the multi-species teams with human members would perform at or above average, due to the human tendency toward cooperative behavior being a useful moderating influence. The results confirmed this. He made a note to include the data point in his next report to the headmaster, as evidence that the classification system was functioning correctly. He did not notice that the human student designated H7 had functionally coordinated a team of 5, without anyone quite seeing her do it. He was, in fairness, thinking about Dawn. Mara turned 17 in the 4th month. She celebrated by calling her mother on the comm terminal in her room, an 8-minute conversation that cost her most of her monthly communication allowance. Her mother asked how she was eating. Mara said fine. Her mother said she didn't sound fine. Mara said she was fine, she was just tired. The moon's light cycle was different from Earth's and she was still adjusting. Her mother said she'd send a care package. Mara said please don't. The import restrictions were complicated and it would cost too much. Her mother sent it anyway. It arrived 3 weeks later. 3 bars of a specific chocolate her mother knew she liked, a small cloth figure her youngest brother had made for her, and a folded letter that took Mara 20 minutes to stop crying long enough to finish reading. She kept the cloth figure on her desk, tucked beside the battered paperback novel. She ate the chocolate slowly, 1 small square per evening, because there wasn't very much of it and she wanted it to last. She was not unhappy. She was doing exactly what she had come here to do. But she had not expected to miss the smell of her mother's kitchen quite as much as she did, or the specific weight of her smallest brother falling asleep on her shoulder, or the sound of street noise in a language she didn't have to think about understanding. These were small things. She had always been good at small things. Pitta found her on a Tuesday evening, the day of cataloging, which Mara had developed a private fondness for by now, sitting cross-legged on her bed with the paperback open in her lap, staring at the wall. "You are thinking," Pitta said. It was not a question. Pitta was very perceptive in the way that certain mathematicians are perceptive. She noticed patterns even in things that weren't numbers. "Yes," Mara said. Pitta climbed onto her own bed and hugged her knees. "About what?" Mara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "About how most people think small means safe." Pitta considered this. "Does it?" "No," Mara said. "Small means undetected." She went back to her book. The crisis, when it came, did not announce itself. That was the thing about crises. The real ones never did. It started with Advisor Don. He had, over the course of 4 months, assembled enough support to formally request that the headmaster commission an independent review of the threat assessment matrix. The headmaster, who was old and cautious, and increasingly aware that the political landscape of the Dominion was shifting in ways the Academy needed to reflect, agreed. Pellock, informed of the review, had reacted with controlled fury, controlled because he was a politician as well as a scientist, and political fury was always controlled. The review committee was announced on a Thursday morning. By Thursday afternoon, the faculty had divided along clear lines, and by Friday, the divisions had become impossible to ignore. Tess, sensing that her alliance with Pellock might become a liability, began a quiet recalibration of her position, not abandoning him, not yet, but creating distance. Dawn, reading her recalibration correctly, reached out through intermediaries. It was, Mara noted from her position of careful middle-distance observation, the moment when the palace forgot to watch the gates. She had been waiting for a moment like this, not because she was predatory, not because she was planning anything that could be called hostile, but because she understood, in the bone-deep way she understood most things, that windows opened and closed, and that the question was never whether you'd be ready when they opened. The question was what you intended to walk through them to do. What she intended to do was go to the server room. The server room was 3 levels below the administrative wing, accessible through a standard corridor that required faculty clearance, or through maintenance tunnel C7, which ran parallel to it, and had a junction point that technically connected to the server room's secondary access panel. A panel that existed for emergency maintenance purposes, and therefore operated on a different authorization tier than the main door. The access tier it operated on was, specifically, the same tier as the student maintenance request system, because when the Academy's infrastructure had been designed 40 years ago, the engineer responsible for the secondary access panel had used a default setting and nobody had noticed, because nobody had thought to look. Mara had thought to look. She went on a Wednesday night, during the peak of the faculty conflict, when Thess's surveillance protocol was generating so many flags from legitimate political activity that the threshold for automated review had been raised by 40% to prevent the system from drowning. She wore her standard uniform. She carried the paperback novel. She moved at the pace of someone going somewhere boring. The maintenance tunnel was unremarkable. She had been through it twice before, for entirely legitimate reasons, and she had noted the junction point both times without doing anything about it. The third time, she did something about it. The secondary access panel opened. She stepped into the server room. She had 11 minutes before the patrol cycle brought a security drone past the exterior corridor, the patrol she'd been tracking since the first day. She used 9 of them. She did not take anything. She did not damage anything. She read very quickly in the way she read things, the way she had always read things, with the particular human cognitive machinery that her species had evolved over 100,000 years of needing to assess, remember, and respond to vast quantities of information in very short time frames. She read the structure of the Academy's administrative database. She read the student classification files. She read the threat assessment scores, her own included. Category 3, limited potential, monitored. She noted, with a feeling that was not quite amusement and not quite sadness, that the monitoring sub-file contained 14 weeks of surveillance flags, none of which had been investigated beyond the initial review. She read 3 other things, which she committed to the specific kind of memory that did not require notes or ciphers. Then she left the server room, walked back through maintenance tunnel C7, and returned to her room in time to read another chapter of her novel before bed. Pitta was already asleep. The cloth figure from her brother sat on the desk. She looked at it for a while in the dark. She had known, before she came, that there was a probability, not a certainty, but a non-trivial probability, that the Academy's classification of humans would eventually drive policy decisions that humans wouldn't like. Category 3 wasn't just a label. It determined which resources were allocated to human students, what career pathways were available to them within Dominion institutions, what legal standing their home systems would have in the next round of accord negotiations. She had read the policy documents. She understood what Category 3 meant in practice. She had also known, before she came, that the way to change a classification wasn't to argue against it. Arguing against it required acknowledgement, and acknowledgement required the kind of attention that brought its own complications. The way to change a classification was to make the classification wrong, and make it wrong in a way that nobody quite saw you doing. What she had read in the server room confirmed what she had suspected. The review of Pellock's matrix was not, in fact, commissioned to benefit the smaller species. It was commissioned as a move in a political game between Don and Pellock, and whichever one of them came out ahead would inherit a matrix that still placed humans in Category 3. Don's proposed revisions, which she had now read, updated the matrix for accuracy in 17 of its measurement categories. It did not touch the methodology by which it defined what was worth measuring. The chess board was not the problem. The rules of chess were the problem. She went to sleep. She had a mathematics examination in the morning. The examination went well. She finished early, which she always did, and spent the remaining time doing a final check of her work, which she had already checked twice in her head before she put anything on paper. The proctor, a young Volkai named Fenn who was working toward a teaching qualification, had been watching the human students with the mild scientific interest that the faculty generally brought to observing their subjects. She told him afterward, sincerely, that she'd found the course very useful. She went to see advisor Don that afternoon. She had not made an appointment. She had calculated that Don was meeting with one of the headmaster's deputies at the 3rd hour, which meant his office would be empty between the 2nd and 3rd hour, which was when she arrived. His administrative assistant, a groom named Pell, told her that the advisor was unavailable. Mara said she understood and could she leave a document for him. She produced a sealed folder, physical, not digital, which was a choice she had been deliberate about. Pell took it. Mara thanked him and left. Inside the folder was a 6-page document. She had written it over the course of 2 weeks, in standard academic Volkai, in the administrative dialect. It was titled, a preliminary analysis of methodological gaps in multi-species threat assessment frameworks, with reference to adaptive cognitive capacity as an unclassified variable. It was, in its form, a standard academic paper. In its substance, it was something else, a polite, meticulous 1,800-word demonstration that the threat assessment matrix could not correctly classify species with high adaptive cognitive capacity, because it had no measurement category for adaptive cognitive capacity, and that this represented a significant gap not in Pellock's implementation of the matrix. She was very careful to note that the implementation was technically sound, but in its fundamental design assumptions. She had not signed it with her name. She had signed it with her student number, H7, and her species designation, human. She had not argued that humans should be reclassified. She had not suggested any specific revision. She had simply, precisely, and irrefutably demonstrated that the matrix's answer to the question, "How dangerous is this species?" could only ever be as good as the matrix's definition of dangerous, and that the current definition was measuring something like the outline of a shadow and calling it the thing that made it. She had been careful with the language. She was always careful with the language. She walked to the cafeteria and had dinner with Pitta and two of her other friends, and did not think about the document again. Don read it that evening, in the 40 minutes between his meeting with the deputy and his dinner with 3 colleagues he was working on converting to his position. He read it twice. Then he sat very still for about 6 minutes, which was a long time to sit still, even for a Volkai. He understood what it was. He understood what it wasn't. He turned it over and over, looking for the angle, because there was always an angle when someone handed you something this useful at exactly this moment. He could not find it, which was either because there was no angle or because he was not smart enough to see it. He was smart enough to recognize that distinction. He did not immediately do anything with the document. Instead, he filed it carefully in a private folder and thought about it for 3 days. On the 4th day, he forwarded it to the review committee chair with a note explaining that it had come to him through a student channel and raised concerns he thought the committee should consider. He attributed it accurately. H7, human, student cohort. The review committee chair was a Volkai academic from a different institution, specifically chosen to be neutral, which made her genuinely neutral, which made her genuinely interested in the document on its own terms rather than as a political object. She read it carefully. She read it again. She showed it to 2 colleagues. 3 weeks later, the committee's interim report included a new section, Adaptive Cognitive Capacity as a Gap in Current Assessment Methodology. The section cited a student paper, attributed to H7 Human, as raising the initial concern that prompted the committee's deeper examination. The interim report went to the headmaster. The headmaster read it. The headmaster, who had been running an institution for 30 years and had developed a sophisticated nose for the shape of things, sent a query to the Academic Affairs Office asking for the student record of H7. Mara received a summons to the headmaster's office on a Monday afternoon, 3 weeks before the end of term. She put on her uniform. She tucked her braids into her collar. She walked to the administrative wing at the measured pace of someone going somewhere boring, which she had now been doing for long enough that it felt natural. Not a performance, but a genuine part of her, one more adaptation, one more shape she'd grown into. The headmaster's office was large and overlooked the moon's ocean. The ocean was dark at this depth, but the office lighting made the window panels glow with a diffuse blue that she found genuinely beautiful. She sat in the chair she was indicated toward and waited. The headmaster studied her for a moment. He was old, in the Volkai manner of old, not frail but settled, as though he had stopped moving toward things and started being where he was. His neck frills were gray. "You wrote the paper," he said. "It was not a question." "Yes," she said. "You did not sign it with your name." "I thought the argument should stand on its own." He was quiet for a moment. "You have been here 4 months." "And 3 weeks," she said. 4 months and 3 weeks, he agreed. "And in that time, our surveillance protocols generated 14 flags on your activity, none of which, upon review, indicated any irregularity." He paused. "I have since reviewed them myself." She waited. "Our system," he said carefully, "appears to have been observing you very carefully and correctly noting that everything you were doing was within the boundaries of permitted student behavior. This is accurate." "Yes," she said. "It noted, for instance, that you spent a significant amount of time in the library, consulting a limited set of materials. It correctly noted that all of those materials were publicly accessible. What it did not note was what you might have been doing with those materials." She said nothing. She had learned over a lifetime of being underestimated that there were moments when saying nothing was the most eloquent possible response. "The interim committee report," the headmaster continued, "is going to create significant disruption. Advisor Pellock is already preparing a formal rebuttal. Advisor Don is positioning it as a vindication of his review request. Advisor Thess has issued a statement expressing support for the committee's rigor while carefully not endorsing any specific conclusion." He folded his hands. "The paper you wrote will be at the center of this for some time." "I expect so," she said. "I want to understand something," he said, "not for any administrative purpose, for my own understanding." He looked at her directly. "What were you trying to do?" She thought about her mother's kitchen. She thought about the cloth figure on her desk and the specific chocolate that was running out, one square at a time. She thought about Pitta, sleeping across the room, sketching topological proofs in her notebook. She thought about Theo's mathematics scores and Adi's argument in the ethics colloquium. She thought about the 87 other species in the academy, most of them category 3 or below, most of them sorted and labeled and orbiting the center of things. "The matrix," she said, "can't see what it doesn't know to look for." "Yes," the headmaster said, "that is what the paper argues." "I thought someone should point that out." He was quiet again. The blue light moved in the window behind him. She did not rush to fill the silence. "You are 17 years old," he said at last. "Yes." "The paper you wrote will, if the committee adopts its methodology, require a complete reconstruction of the assessment framework. This will take years. The political implications within the Dominion will be significant. Several classification decisions, including those affecting your species status in the next accord negotiations, will need to be revisited." "I know," she said. "Did you know," he asked slowly, "that writing this paper might lead to this outcome?" She looked at him steadily. She had very dark eyes, and she had been told at various points in her life that when she looked at you directly it felt like something specific, not threat, not intensity in any dramatic sense, just the unambiguous experience of being genuinely seen. "I suspected," she said. The headmaster unfolded his hands. He looked at the window for a moment. "Our intake system," he said, "flagged you on your registration day because your biometric profile produced 4 distinct readings." "The scanner was sensitive," she said. "Temperature differentials, I'd come from outside." "Yes," he said, "that was the official explanation." Neither of them said anything for a moment. "I will be recommending," the headmaster said, "that you be transferred to the advanced academic stream for your 2nd year. There is also a research fellowship associated with the Matrix Review Committee that I think you should be considered for." He paused. "This recommendation will be controversial." "I'll manage," she said. He almost smiled. It was hard to tell with Voakai, but she had been paying attention for 4 months and 3 weeks, and she thought he almost smiled. She walked back through the administrative wing in the afternoon light. She did not hurry. She was thinking about 2nd year, about what she might learn, about what she would need to understand before she could begin to understand the next thing. The Vorkai called Tuesdays the day of cataloging. She had always liked Tuesdays. In the weeks that followed, the faculty debate reached its peak. Pellock submitted a 17-page rebuttal of the interim report, which was well-argued and technically sound, and failed entirely to address the core methodological concern, which was not a technical problem, and therefore couldn't be solved by technical argument. Don circulated the rebuttal with commentary, which Pellock took as bad faith. Thess called for a faculty assembly. The assembly was contentious. Through all of it, a student paper by H. Human sat at the center of the argument like a stone that had been dropped in the water, the ripples still moving. Mara went to her classes. She had dinner with Pitta and her friends. She used the last 2 squares of her chocolate on the night that the committee adopted the core recommendation of the paper, requiring a full review of the matrix's measurement categories. She ate them one at a time, in the dark, in her room, with the cloth figure from her brother on the desk and the paperback novel closed at her elbow. Pitta came in at some point and sat on her bed without saying anything. After a while, Pitta said, "Did you know it was going to work?" Mara thought about this honestly. "I knew there was a chance." "How big a chance?" She considered. "Big enough to try, small enough to keep to myself." Pitta nodded slowly. She had the mathematical mind's tolerance for uncertainty, not comfort with it exactly, but a working relationship. She knew that most important things happened in the space between certainty and nothing. "They're all arguing," Pitta said. "Pellock and Don and the committee, about what to change, what to measure, big arguments." She paused. "And it was one paper, 6 pages. 6 pages, Mara agreed. Written by a student who everyone thought was average. "Not everyone," Mara said. "The headmaster is fairly sharp." Pitta looked at her for a moment. Then she said, in the grown manner that she used when she was being very precise, "Were you ever actually average?" Mara looked at the window. The moon's ocean moved beyond it, dark and vast and patient. "I was always exactly as average as I needed to be," she said. She picked up her book. Pitta picked up her topology notebook. The room was quiet. In the corridor outside, somewhere in the administrative machinery of an institution built to catalog and contain and understand the things it encountered, something had begun to shift. Not loudly, not dramatically, not in the way that anything worth understanding ever shifts, not all at once, not with any single announcement. Slowly, quietly. The way water finds the edge of a thing and keeps going. The Vorkai were very good at cataloging. But they had never, until now, tried to catalog the particular and remarkable quality of a human who had decided, with great deliberateness and very little noise, to matter. The research fellowship was announced on a Friday. By Saturday morning, the faculty politics had rearranged themselves around it the way iron filings rearrange around a new magnet. Pellock objected formally. He submitted a 3-page memo to the headmaster's office arguing that placing a Category 3 student in a research fellowship associated with the review committee was premature. Not because the student had done anything wrong, he was careful to note, but because the classification review was still ongoing, and it created a conflict of interest to have a member of the species under review participating in the review process. The argument was procedurally sound. It was also, as anyone who read it carefully could see, the argument of someone who understood exactly what the paper had done and was trying to limit its damage without looking like he was trying to limit its damage. Thess did not object formally. She did something more interesting. She had a private conversation with Don, which a junior faculty member inadvertently overheard and partially reported to a third party, who told someone else, who eventually told advisor Don's administrative assistant, who told nobody but had a very thoughtful expression for the rest of the afternoon. The substance of what Thess had said to Don was never fully confirmed. But the texture of the faculty meeting 3 days later suggested she had said something like, "This is moving faster than anyone anticipated, and we should all be careful about which side of it we're standing on." Mara heard about the fellowship from the headmaster's assistant, a formal Voakai named As who communicated everything in the same even tone regardless of content, so that good news and disappointing news arrived with identical emotional weight. She thanked him. She walked back to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the cloth figure on her desk. She had not expected the fellowship to be announced so quickly. She had expected a slower process, more debate, more committee stages, more of the administrative grinding that characterized Voakai institutional decision-making. The speed told her something. The headmaster was moving deliberately and was comfortable with the political cost. That was either a very good sign about his character, or a sign that the political cost was lower than she'd estimated, which would require recalibrating some of her other assumptions. She picked up her notebook, a physical one, not the paperback, a small ruled book she kept for actual notes, and spent 40 minutes updating her model of the situation. Then she put the notebook away, washed her face, and went to find Pitta for lunch. Pitta had heard about the fellowship already. The Groom Communication Network, which operated through a system of rapid and cheerful gossip that made human social media look leisurely, had it within hours of the announcement. Pitta greeted her with a complicated expression that contained approximately equal parts pride, excitement, and something that might have been nervousness. "Everyone is talking about it," Pitta said. "I know," Mara said. "Some of them are talking about you." H7, Pitta paused. "They don't know your name yet." "That's okay." Pitta looked at her. "Are you nervous?" Mara considered this honestly. "A little," she said. "I'm more nervous about the mathematics colloquium next week." Pitta laughed, which was a groan sound like small bells, and it broke some of the stiffness in the moment. And they ate their lunch and talked about topology. And for a little while the fellowship and the matrix and the political weight of 6 pages of academic Voakai receded into the background of just being 2 students eating lunch, which was what they were, among other things. The mathematics colloquium went well. She presented a short paper on adaptive constraint propagation, a topic she had chosen partly for its genuine interest, and partly because it was about the way systems with rigid rules behave when those rules encounter boundaries the systems weren't designed to anticipate. The faculty reviewer had given it a strong grade and a comment that called it mature for the cohort level. She had filed this with the same even internal accounting with which she filed everything. The other 11 humans found out about the fellowship gradually. Adiz was the first to seek her out specifically. She arrived at Mara's door one evening with the directness that characterized everything she did, knocked twice, and when Mara opened the door said, "You wrote the paper." H7. "Yes," Mara said. Adiz studied her for a moment. She was taller than Mara and broader, with the particular quality of presence that some people had, the kind that meant a room noticed when they walked in. She had been visibly fighting the Academy's assumptions about humans since the first week. Every argument she won made her more visible. Mara had watched and thought, "She is braver than I am," or "She has a different strategy," which amounts to the same thing. "Why didn't you sign your name?" Adiz asked. "The argument needed to be the argument," Mara said, "not about who made it." Adiz was quiet for a moment. "Theo thinks you were being tactical." "Theo is very smart. He thinks it would have been dismissed if they knew a 17-year-old human wrote it." "Maybe," Mara said. "Or maybe the student number and species designation was enough of a name for what it needed to be." Adiz looked at her steadily. "You planned this." Mara thought about the 8 months of language study before arrival, the 4 biometric scans, the 40 minutes in the server room, the 2 weeks of careful, precise, devastating academic Voakai. "I prepared," she said, Planning implies you know how it ends. Adiz was quiet again. Then, with the smile of someone who had spent months being told by various entities that she was exactly as powerful as they had calculated, she said, "Welcome to not being average." "I was always exactly as average as I needed to be," Mara said. Adiz laughed. It was a good laugh. After that, the 12 humans talked more. Not strategically, Mara was careful about that, and would have been careful about it regardless, because she understood the difference between community and coalition, and the risks that came with treating the former as the latter. They talked the way students talk when they share something real, the particular exhaustion of navigating a world that had already decided what you were, the specific comedy of the Academy's more absurd assumptions, the small moments of genuine wonder at being somewhere this strange and this far from everything familiar. Theo told her, one afternoon, about the advanced mathematics seminar he was sitting in on, how he had solved a problem in the third session that none of the Voakai students had managed, and how Pelak had looked at the solution for a long time before saying it was technically correct, but approached from an unexpected direction, and that unexpected directions needed to be checked very carefully before being accepted. Theo had said he understood, and had not said anything else, and had gone home and worked through the verification with complete thoroughness, because he was Theo, and that was what he did, and had returned the next session with a 19-page verification document that Pelak had accepted without comment. "He didn't say I was right," Theo said. "He didn't say you were wrong either," Mara said. "No," Theo smiled. It was a particular kind of smile, not bitter, not triumphant, something more durable than either. "I think that's going to be what this looks like for a while, being right in a way they accept without saying they accept." "For a while," Mara agreed, "and then longer, and then one day it changes and you can't point to when it changed." He looked at her. "Is that what you think happened with the paper?" She considered. "I think the paper made an argument they couldn't dismiss. I think that's different from making an argument they agreed with. But an argument you can't dismiss is the first step toward one you eventually have to accept." Theo thought about this. "That's very patient." "It's very realistic," she said, "which sometimes looks like patience from the outside." The committee's final report came out 8 weeks before the end of term. It was 112 pages long. Mara read it in one sitting in the library, with her notebook open beside her and her paperback closed for once, because this was not a day for appearances. The report was thorough. It identified 17 specific gaps in the current matrix. It proposed a new measurement category, adaptive cognitive plasticity, that would require entirely new assessment methodologies to implement, methodologies that did not yet exist and would need to be developed over the next several years. It recommended an immediate provisional reclassification review for all Category 3 species with demonstrated high ACP indicators. It cited H7 human in the acknowledgements. Not in the bibliography, in the acknowledgements, which was, in academic Voakai convention, a different kind of citation, one that meant, "This work was part of how we got here." She sat with that for a moment. Then she wrote one line in her notebook, in the private cipher that nobody else could read. "It started." Not "it's done," not "it worked," "it started." She closed the notebook and went to find Pitta, because Pitta was doing her topology finals and needed someone to quiz her on the theorem she kept second-guessing. And this was also important, and this was also real, and the day had enough weight in it already without her sitting alone in the library making it larger. Pelak resigned from his position as head of species assessment at the end of term. He did not retire. He moved laterally into a research role, which was a face-saving arrangement that nobody officially acknowledged as such. His matrix would continue to exist in modified form, credited to him, reshaped by others. Don was appointed interim head of species assessment. This was, Mara had assessed from the beginning, probably what the whole affair had been about for him. She did not resent this. He had used the paper as a political object because it was useful to him. The paper had used his political ambitions as a delivery mechanism because that was what had been available. Neither of them had needed to trust the other for both things to be true simultaneously. This was, she had come to understand, frequently how things actually worked. Tess adapted. This was what Tess did. Mara respected this straightforwardly, the way she respected anyone who read the situation correctly and moved accordingly. Tess updated her surveillance protocols, not in response to anything Mara had done specifically, because there was nothing in the surveillance record that constituted a transgression. She updated them because a paper by a student had revealed that the protocols were measuring the right activities without knowing what to look for, and this was simply true, and acknowledging it was correct. Mara noted the updated protocols and adjusted accordingly, not because she had been doing anything the new protocols would catch. She hadn't been. She was extremely careful about what the word transgression meant and where its edges were. But because understanding a system meant understanding it when it changed, and she would always need to understand the system she was in. The fellowship began in the second week of the new term. She was the youngest person in the committee's working group by 12 years. She sat at the end of the long table and asked questions that were genuinely questions. She had a great deal she still didn't know, and she knew she didn't know it, and occasionally offered observations that she framed as observations rather than conclusions, and listened very carefully to everything that was said around her. She was learning. This was, she had always understood, the point. Not the paper, not the fellowship, not the classification review or the accord negotiations that would eventually be affected by it. The point was always the learning. The accumulation of the specific kind of understanding that came from being in the room, from watching how decisions were made, how power moved, how institutions bent and where they wouldn't, what the language of compromise sounded like at its most precise, and what it sounded like when it was blunter than it meant to be. She was 17 years old, and she was the only human in the room, and she was, as far as most of the people in the room could tell, a promising student who had written one very good paper. This was fine with her. She had a long time. At night in the room she shared with Pitta, she read her paperback novel. It was not an especially good novel. She had finished it twice and found it inconsistent, but she kept it because the spine had her cipher in it, and because it was the same book she had been carrying since she arrived, and there was something in the continuity of it that mattered. Objects that had been with you through things became different objects afterward. Not better, not worse, just layered. The cloth figure from her brother sat on the desk. She had 3 weeks of chocolate left from a new package her mother had sent, which she was rationing more carefully this time, because she had learned, over the course of one term, the particular discipline of making things last when you weren't sure when the next one would come. She was learning everything. The Volkai Academy continued to catalog. It was what it did, and it would continue to do it, and the cataloging would get better and more accurate over time, slowly. The way anything that required dismantling old assumptions and rebuilding them from different materials gets better, which is to say slowly and unevenly, and with considerable resistance from the parts of the system that had been comfortable before. But it was already different from what it had been. And somewhere in the deep and patient machinery of that difference, because of one girl who had arrived quietly and sat in the middle of the room, and never raised her hand before being called on and spent extra hours in the library and wrote 6 pages in careful, precise, irrefutable administrative Volkai, something had shifted. Not loudly. Not all at once. The way water finds the edge of a thing and doesn't stop. The Volkai were very good at cataloging. They had not cataloged this. Her second year at the academy began on a morning that the moon Pelassus offered one of its rare intervals of clear atmosphere, when the pressure layers aligned in a way that let light fall through the ocean's upper reaches in long, slanted columns of pale gold. She stood at her room's small porthole for a few minutes and watched it before getting dressed. Pitta was still asleep. She had spent the summer on Earth, 8 weeks at home, which had been both longer and shorter than she expected. Longer because every day was dense with the specific gravity of being back. Her mother's kitchen, her brother's, the street noise, the weight of familiar air. Shorter because the 8 weeks ended anyway, the way everything did, and she packed her bag and went through the same departure corridor she had gone through a year before. And this time she did not need to count the security cameras because she had already counted them. Her mother had hugged her at the terminal for a long time without saying anything. Her smallest brother had fallen asleep on her shoulder on the transit to the port. These were the small things. She was very good at small things. The working group met for the first time in the second week of term. There were 7 of them, now including 3 external academics and a Vaukai administrator from the Dominion's central body, who was there, officially, to ensure the review was coordinated with broader policy processes, and unofficially, to report on whether the review was heading somewhere the Dominion's central body would be comfortable with. His name was Advisor Rank Voss. He was polished in the way of people who had spent careers in institutions and understood their surfaces very well. He had reviewed Mara's file before the meeting. She knew this because he had looked at her when she sat down with the specific recognition of someone who has seen a photograph. He had then arranged his face into a neutral expression that was itself a kind of message. I know what you are, and I am going to watch carefully. She smiled at him. She meant it to be friendly, and she meant it to be completely legible, and she watched him receive both messages simultaneously and decide he couldn't tell which one was real. Both were real. That was the part that was easy to miss. The meeting was 2 hours long. She said 4 things. Each of them was accurate and specific and placed into the conversation at a moment when it could land without friction. She did not say 11 other things that she had thought of and decided not to say yet. Not because they were wrong, but because the timing wasn't right, and timing was part of what made something useful rather than just true. Afterward, one of the external academics, a Vaukai named Essie from a university on the Dominion's 7th world, who had a reputation for methodological precision and a manner that suggested she did not suffer inexactness happily, stopped her in the corridor. Your first paper, Essie said. I read it before the committee released its report. I know, Mara said. You were on the pre-review panel. Essie looked at her. Yes, a pause. You did your research before the meeting today as well. I tried to, Mara said. Essie studied her for a moment. She had pale gray frills, which indicated mid-level rank, though Mara had already read enough about her to know the rank underrepresented the actual influence. The question I keep returning to, Essie said, is whether the paper was instinct or design. Mara thought about how to answer this. She thought about her mother's kitchen and her cipher and the server room and the 87 other species and Pitta's topology and Theo's 19-page verification and Adie's laugh. I think, she said, it was preparation mostly. Instinct is what happens when preparation meets a moment. Essie was quiet. Then she said, you understand this is going to take years. Yes, Mara said. And that the accord negotiations are 18 months out, and whatever the committee produces before then may not be implementable in time to affect the classification decisions that matter most. Yes, she said again. And this doesn't discourage you. She looked at Essie directly, with the dark-eyed steadiness that she'd been told felt like being genuinely seen. Should it? Essie was quiet for a long moment. The corridor moved around them. Students, faculty, the ordinary traffic of an institution that continued regardless of what happened inside any individual conversation. No, Essie said finally, I don't suppose it should. She paused once more, turning to go. H7. Mara, she said. My name is Mara. Essie nodded. Something in her manner shifted, very slightly, in the way that acknowledgments shift things, the small frills of acceptance that occur before the larger ones do. Mara, she said. Then she walked down the corridor, back toward her own work, which was the work of rebuilding something that had needed rebuilding for a long time. And Mara stood for a moment in the pale ocean light filtering through the arched windows and breathed, and thought about the long shape of years, and what could be done inside them, and began to walk back toward her own.